Hello, my name is Jorre Hadley. Today we will be discussing the importance of James Baldwin during the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, my apologies. James Baldwin is prominent in Black history. Born August 2nd, 1924 in Harlem, New York, James had much influence in his early life by people of all walks of life. He had close, authentic relationships with teachers like Bill Miller, Countee Cullen, and Herman Porter, as well as painter Buford Delaney and others. A lot of these people became mentors and extremely important people in Baldwin's lives who really shaped the person that he is today. These people have come to be some of the most important people in Baldwin's lives, as their impact helped Baldwin create the very being he is and bring about his passions and truths. James Baldwin was an essayist who explored bold conversations with an articulate yet somewhat cruel deliverance. Racial, class distinctions, as well as sexual essays were brought about in eloquent ways and were extremely substantial to Black people in America. James Baldwin, 1963, and the House That Race Built by Frederick C. Harris. So, in June 11th, President Kennedy gave a civil rights speech and spoke about the Negro struggle for rights being a moral issue, necessitating a Civil Rights Act. Baldwin and his crew of activists, these people were people like Lena Horne, Kenneth Cloth, people of that caliber, that really spoke out against racial oppression and different things like that. Baldwin and his crew of activists were lambasting Kennedy for not having the courage to take a moral stand against racial segregation. Baldwin informed Kennedy that because of the nation's mistreatments of Blacks, he should not expect Black men to fight for their country, an unpatriotic revelation that shocked Kennedy. So Baldwin speaks to Kennedy about not being able to have the courage to take a moral stand against racial segregation not only for his speech, but also because the group of activists expected Kennedy to walk a little Black girl into a school that was predominantly white. And they wanted him to do this because they assumed that if the president walked in with the little girl, that people would have more respect for the child because the president is here and the president, again, is taking stand against segregation. So this would be him saying we should come together. However, Kennedy was unable to do that. Though there is a tendency to construct King and Malcolm as a binary of Black thought and action during that era, Baldwin, standing in between titans of nonviolent resistance and love for their oppressors, and Malcolm X's condemnations of white devils, Baldwin insists on a different claim. He believed that Blacks should not be cast off as strangers in the house that they share with their countrymen, a house whose foundation was built with the hands of their ancestors as well as on the mythology of race. Baldwin mediates the binary by raising objections to King's and Malcolm's ideological blind spots. So often when we speak about James Baldwin, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X are spoke about because Baldwin shares views with the both of them. So it really puts him in the middle because there's things that he agrees and disagrees with the two people. Like Malcolm, Baldwin found the philosophy of nonviolent resistance short-sighted because it is required to bear the burdens of a problem, and a history that they did not create themselves. Baldwin understood the rage of Malcolm and the Nation of Islam and how that rage nurtured Black pride. Baldwin states, there is no reason that Black men should be expected to be more patient, more forbearing, more far-seeing than whites. Baldwin found Malcolm's and the Nation of Islam's invention of history, an invention grounded fundamentally of the hatred in others. The difference in King's version of love and Baldwin's were merely the same. Baldwin insisted that those who were conscious enough, Blacks, whites, or whomever, should take the leap like lovers and end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. Baldwin requires the transcendence of the realities of color, of nations, and of altars. A part of the essay, The Fire the Next Time, Baldwin states, hatred and love belong together. They are both destructive. You can afford them only in private and as people, only so long as you are not free. In a debate with William F. Buckley, Jr. at Cambridge Union in 1965, Baldwin emphasized the hard labor done by African Americans for the benefit of our counterparts. I will briefly give a recap of a few things he said. I picked cotton, I carried it to the market, I built the railroads under someone else's whip for nothing. The Southern oligarchy, which has still today so very much power in Washington, was created by my labor and my sweat and the violation of my women and the murder of my children. So he really speaks in the first person when he says this, but he's referring to, of course, his ancestors and the burdens that African Americans as a whole has had to carry. Because although, as we know, slavery is over, African Americans still face the repercussions and the aftermath of this. Baldwin says that race matters because of the slights, the snickers, the silent judgments that reinforce the most crippling thoughts that I do not belong here. James Baldwin believed that white America needed to confront its past sins, its present injuries, and its continued denials if there were to be a future. White America needs to work out its neurosis regarding the Negro. Baldwin insisted that his countrymen needed to find out in their own hearts why it was necessary to have an N-word in the first place. He states, "I'm not an N-word, I'm a man. If I'm not an N-word here, and if you, the white people, invented him, then you've got to find out why." Now we will be heading over to James Baldwin, which is a biography written by David Lennon. In Notes of a Native Son, Baldwin touched on his issues such as the search for identity in a world that, because of its racial myths, cannot recognize reality. The acceptance of one's inheritance, as in the mystery of color, is the inheritance of every American as one claims one's birthright. Baldwin is able to reach his white readers by his words without using the crudeness Black Americans face. Instead, he made some of his work receptive for those who don't live the same lifestyles. Baldwin spoke in a way that validated the Black experience while still making it a piece that was subtle to foreign ears. Baldwin made Notes of a Native Son into 3 separate parts. The first explored the identity of the Black man and with the African American as an artist. The second reached to essays on Black lives in America and the search for self and ethnic identity. Part 3 contained essays written to the U.S. from Baldwin's European perspective. Being that Baldwin eventually moved to Paris, Paris was where he got a lot of his writing done. So I would assume being that you are not in the place where the turmoil is happening, you're able to have a more objective perspective because you're not entirely inside of it. In The Crusade of Indignation, Baldwin speaks on Uncle Tom's Cabin and suggests that it has set the tone for the attitude of American whites towards Black people for the last 100 years. Baldwin saw the issues in the South as another version of the American nation. In his own words, it clings to 2 antithetical doctrines, 2 histories. The Southerner is the proud citizen of a free society, and on the other hand, is committed to a society that has not yet dared to free itself of the necessity of naked and brutal oppression. He would eventually return home for events a part of the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. Kenneth Clark was fascinated with Baldwin upon reading Notes of a Native Son and saw him as an important potential member of the Civil Rights Movement and revealed information about the movement and the important figures a part of it. Baldwin thus became concerned with desegregation after his visit to the South. Martin Luther King Jr. eventually invited Baldwin to Alabama to see the fruits of the bus boycott. Baldwin eventually went on a lecture tour in the South for the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE, where he mostly presented in churches. While on tour for CORE, Baldwin consistently spoke on the need to end racism as what they own to African Americans would continue to increase. owed to African Americans. Although Baldwin fell between the lines of Malcolm and King's views, he resonated and saw the most change in SNCC and CORE. In May, Baldwin would send a telegram to Kennedy to which he would invite Baldwin to breakfast May 23rd. Baldwin had the ears of the president and would take advantage of this moment. Kennedy asked Baldwin questions like, what do black people want? And what black people will others listen to? I suppose as a means of repairing the rights of the people, but Baldwin, along with others like Harry Belafonte, Kenneth Clark, and Lena Horne, as well as others, wanted Kennedy to approach this as a moral issue in which he was ideally incapable of. They wanted Kennedy to escort a black child into school. Everyone seen this as a moral commitment, as I stated earlier. And the point being, with the president being present, anyone who spits on that child will be spitting on the nation. Now I'll be moving on to notes by The Fire This Time, James Baldwin and the Civil Rights Movement by Robert Pfeiffer. Baldwin was one of the most prominent writers of his time. He was ultimately not accepted by the integrationist wing of the civil rights movement. He often shocked northern liberals with his comments and made seen as a polemic propagandist and radical. He was also unaccepted by the militant wing of the movement, being the Black Panthers, who saw him as a sellout to the white society in his writings and his black manhood by being an open gay, specifically Eldridge Cleaver, being the person who really spoke about James Baldwin again and how he basically coddles foreign ears and being an open gay man. Eldridge Cleaver really writes about this in his book, where we find a lot of the evidence that he's really opposed to James Baldwin and some of his views. Baldwin believed black and white people could live together and that separation was not needed amongst the groups. However, the civil rights movement was not about integration of blacks into white society, but changing white society by forcing it to accept what it had done to blacks. So again, although the civil rights movement is about getting the white society to see their wrongs and accepting black people as a whole and for who they are, Baldwin really brought his own agenda to the civil rights movement. So Baldwin really advocated for human rights more than civil rights, because he's seen black and white people not necessarily as one, but as one. He saw black and white people and others as all people, as a human race, rather than there being a divide. Baldwin spoke more of human rights than black or civil rights because he believed more in humanity rather than black rights given by whites. Baldwin directed his messages more towards whites in America than blacks. He preferred using King's tactic by influencing whites who normally would not listen to him, which was something that he was very, very good at, because as we see in his writing, James Baldwin was able to attract a lot of other people other than people who have shared experiences with him. He also worked towards eliminating the negative self-image black people in America had of themselves, realizing that the dominant white society had stripped the black man of his own individuality. Baldwin eventually extended the civil rights to all people, making issues about humanity universal rather than black people nationally. The human rights movement eventually came into place, which was Baldwin's goal, getting rights of the human being recognized for all.